There is a moment. Maybe it happened to you last week, maybe it happened this morning, when you are sitting alone in a quiet room, and something rises up in your chest that you cannot quite name. Not sadness, not happiness, something quieter than both. You look at your hands, folded in your lap, and you realize they belong to someone who has lived an entire life. Decades of mornings, thousands of goodbyes, a whole world of people who are no longer in the room with you. And in that moment, a thought arrives, uninvited. Nobody warned me it would feel like this. Not the aches. Not the slower mornings. This particular kind of knowing. Maybe someone asked you, recently, "How are you doing?" And you answered fine. The way you always do, while the real answer sat quietly underneath, unspoken, too complicated to hand to someone standing in a hurry by the door. If you have felt that moment, that strange, private clarity that seems to come only after 70, then what you are about to hear was written for you. Because there are truths about this stage of life that almost no one says out loud. Not children, not doctors, not even close friends who are living through the very same thing beside you in silence. And today we are going to say them one by one, plainly, without softening them into something smaller and safer than they really are. In the next 50 minutes, we are going to walk through 8 truths about life after 70. Truths that rarely make it into greeting cards and almost never get spoken at family dinners. These are not truths meant to frighten you. They are meant to hand you back something you may have quietly lost along the way. The feeling of being understood. Some of these truths will feel like relief. Others will feel like a mirror. A few might bring tears you didn't expect. And that is all right, because wisdom rarely arrives quietly. By the end, you may find that the parts of your life you thought were only yours to carry. The silence, the grief, the small joys nobody notices, are truths shared by nearly everyone who has walked this far down the road. Let's begin. Reason number 1 is the truth that quietly changes how every other truth on this list will land. So it seems right to start here, before we go anywhere else. Maybe you've noticed it while watching an ordinary sunset that seemed to last longer than it should have. Or during a phone call with a grandchild, where every single word suddenly carried more weight than words used to carry. Have you ever wondered why an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon can suddenly feel almost sacred, for no reason you could explain to anyone else? Here is the truth nobody tells you. Time does not get shorter after 70. It gets more real. When you were younger, time felt like an ocean, endless, formless, something you could waste without noticing the loss. You rushed through dinners to get to the next thing. You half listened to stories because you assumed there would always be another chance to hear them again. But something shifts as the decades accumulate. You start to sense the edges of things. Not because you are afraid, though fear visits sometimes, but because awareness has quietly replaced assumption. And in that shift, something unexpected happens. Moments stop being generic and start being specific. The particular color of your granddaughter's laugh. The exact way your spouse's hand feels in yours during a quiet evening. The smell of coffee on a Sunday that used to mean nothing and now means everything you have left. Psychologists have long observed that as people sense time is limited, they naturally begin filtering their attention, pulling away from things that do not matter and drawing closer to the handful of things that do. Younger people, sensing endless time ahead, chase breadth. New friends, new achievements, new horizons, new versions of themselves. But when time feels finite, the mind quietly reorganizes itself around depth instead. You stop collecting experiences and start savoring them, the way you might slow down over the last bite of a meal you know you won't be served again. This is not decline. This is refinement. It is the mind's way of saying, if there is less time left, let what remains be real, let it be felt all the way through instead of skimmed across the surface. Society often paints aging as a tragic countdown, a clock ticking toward loss, something to be dreaded and postponed at all costs. But almost everyone who has actually lived this stage describes something closer to reverence than dread. Not a countdown, a closeness, a nearness to what matters that younger years simply cannot offer, because younger years are too busy chasing more to ever notice that they already have enough. Even ordinary routines take on new texture. Watering a plant, folding a familiar shirt, hearing rain against a window at night. These are not small things anymore. They have become, quietly and without ceremony, the entire point. Younger family members often struggle to understand this shift, and you may have tried, more than once, to explain it to a son or daughter who simply couldn't follow. You might have said something like, "A whole afternoon with your father in the garden means more to me now than a whole year used to mean at your age," and watch their eyes go slightly blank, not from disrespect, but from genuine incomprehension. They are still living inside the ocean of endless time. You have moved to its shore, where every wave finally has an edge you can see coming, and somehow that makes each one worth watching more closely rather than less. Some people describe returning to a childhood home, decades later, and standing in a doorway where they once rushed through as a teenager without a second thought, only to find themselves now unable to move for several long minutes, overwhelmed by a fullness of feeling that simply wasn't available to them the first time around. That is not nostalgia in the simple sense. It is time finally being felt at its true weight, rather than its assumed one. That's not decline. That's clarity arriving exactly when you needed it most, and staying longer than you expected. Time did not get shorter. It got closer. And once you feel time this closely, once an ordinary afternoon can bring you to the edge of tears for reasons you can't fully explain to anyone else, you begin to understand why so much of what follows on this list will feel less like new information and more like something you always knew, but never quite had the words for until now. Following that same thread of clarity, there is a second truth that tends to surprise people even more than the first, because it feels almost rebellious to admit out loud. Have you noticed yourself saying things lately that you would never have said at 40? Correcting someone gently, or not correcting them at all because it simply doesn't matter anymore? Have you caught yourself wondering, quietly, when did I stop needing everyone in my life to approve of me? Here is the truth. Somewhere after 70, most people quietly stop performing for the audience that used to run their lives. For decades, so many decisions were shaped by an invisible committee, parents whose approval you chased long after they were gone, colleagues whose respect you needed to feel competent, neighbors whose opinions somehow mattered more than they reasonably should have, even children who, with love, still carried expectations of exactly who you were supposed to be. That committee sat quietly in the back of your mind for most of your adult life, editing your choices before you even made them. But age does something curious to that committee. One by one, its influence fades, member by member, until the room in your head grows unexpectedly still. Not because you stopped loving those people, but because you finally understand, at a level deeper than logic can reach, that their opinions were never actually yours to carry in the first place. This is not bitterness. It is liberation, plain and simple. Many describe it as waking up one ordinary morning and realizing they no longer rehearse conversations in their heads before having them, no longer dress for anyone's expectations but their own comfort, no longer say yes to obligations purely out of guilt or fear of disappointing someone. There is a particular kind of psychological freedom that comes from finally understanding that you do not need to be liked by everyone to remain at peace with yourself. Younger adults often mistake this shift for coldness or stubbornness, or what they sometimes unkindly call being difficult in the elderly. It is neither of those things. It is the natural, hard-won result of decades spent quietly gathering evidence about which opinions actually mattered and which ones were simply noise dressed up convincingly as importance. The tragedy, if there is one, is that so many people spend their 30s, 40s, and 50s bending themselves around the expectations of others, only to discover in their 70s that almost none of it was ever necessary. And rather than mourning those years spent bending, most people find something better waiting quietly on the other side. The sturdy, unhurried relief of simply being who you are, without translation, without apology, without performance. Consider the small, ordinary moment of choosing what to wear to a family gathering. At 40, you might have spent 20 minutes deciding, worried about what an in-law might silently judge, or whether a sibling would make a passing comment about your appearance. Now, you reach for the sweater that feels warm and familiar, the one you've worn a dozen times to that same house, and you simply put it on without a second thought crossing your mind. That small act, so easy to overlook, represents an entire lifetime of quiet negotiation finally coming to an end. Or think of the dinner table conversation where, once, you would have swallowed a disagreement to keep the peace, nodding along to a political opinion or a parenting choice you privately found questionable. Now you say, gently but plainly, "I see it differently," and then you let the moment pass without needing it resolved in your favor. Family members sometimes mistake this new directness for a personality change, wondering aloud what's gotten into you lately. Nothing has gotten into you. Something old and unnecessary has finally, quietly, gotten out. That's not you becoming difficult. That's you finally becoming undivided, whole in a way you couldn't afford to be before. The committee in your head has mostly gone quiet now, and in its place is something steadier. Your own voice, finally louder than everyone else's combined. That quiet is not emptiness. It is the sound of a life no longer being negotiated by strangers who never should have had a vote in the first place. From that same freedom, though, comes a truth that carries a very different weight, heavier but no less honest for it. Have you ever caught yourself doing something ordinary? Folding laundry, setting the table for one less person than you used to, and suddenly felt a wave of grief so specific it took your breath away, even though the loss happened years, sometimes decades, ago? Here is the truth nobody prepares you for. Grief does not end. Changes shape, but it never fully leaves. Culture likes to talk about grief as something with stages, a process you move through and eventually complete, like a course you finish and graduate from, receiving some kind of certificate that says you are done now, healed, finished. But nearly everyone who has lived long enough to lose a spouse, a sibling, a lifelong friend, or a child will tell you something different, something truer. Grief does not conclude. It integrates. It becomes a permanent, quiet passenger in your life, sometimes silent for months, and then suddenly present again at the sound of a song. The sight of a coat still hanging in a closet nobody has had the heart to empty. An empty chair at a holiday table that everyone notices but nobody mentions. This is not a sign that you have failed to heal properly. It is, paradoxically, a sign of how deeply and completely you loved. Grief this persistent is not unfinished business. It is simply love with nowhere left to go, still looking for the person it belongs to, still knocking on a door that will not open again. Many people in their 70s and beyond describe carrying grief the way you might carry a stone smoothed by years of handling. Still present, still real, still capable of being felt, but no longer sharp enough to cut the way it once did in those first raw months. The most surprising part, for many, is discovering that grief and joy can occupy the very same day, sometimes the same hour, without contradiction. You can laugh freely with your grandchildren in the afternoon and feel the ache of missing someone by evening, and both feelings are equally true, equally valid, neither one canceling out the other. This coexistence is not confusion. It is maturity. It is the mind's hard-earned way of holding complexity instead of demanding simple, neatly resolved emotions the way it might have when you were younger and less practiced at carrying contradiction. Younger people often expect grief to look a certain way, dramatic, then finished, tidy. But the elders who have lived through real, layered loss know grief as something closer to weather than to a wound. It comes and goes, some days a light rain barely noticed, some days a downpour that catches you completely off guard, but always part of the same sky you now live under, every single day, for the rest of your life. Perhaps you know this feeling exactly. A particular perfume passing you in a grocery store aisle, worn by a stranger who has no idea what she has just done, and suddenly you are 20 years younger, standing beside someone who has been gone for a decade, and the grocery cart in front of you blurs for a moment before you can steady yourself again. Or a song on the car radio, one you haven't heard in years, arriving without warning between the news and the weather, and pulling you so completely into a memory that you have to pull the car over until the verse ends. Many people keep a drawer somewhere in the house, a box of letters, a wedding ring no longer worn but never given away, a recipe card in handwriting only they can still decipher. Not because they are unable to move forward, but because moving forward was never actually the goal. Carrying forward was always the truer aim, and there is a profound difference between the two, one that grief itself eventually teaches you, whether you were ready for the lesson or not. That's not being stuck in the past. That's continuing to love someone the only way still available to you. Grief did not defeat you. It moved in quietly, permanently, and became part of how your heart still beats for the people you've lost. And that permanence, strange as it sounds, is one of the most quietly human truths there is, proof in a way that love was real. Carrying that kind of grief brings us to a truth that sits right beside it. One about the friends who are still here and the ones who no longer are. Have you ever sat down to make a phone call out of old habit and then remembered the person on the other end of that number passed away years ago? Have you noticed your address book slowly turning into something closer to a memorial than a directory? Here is the truth almost no one says plainly. Outliving your friends is one of the loneliest parts of growing older, and it is rarely discussed with the honesty it actually deserves. Society talks about the loss of a spouse fairly openly, talks more cautiously about the loss of siblings, but it rarely acknowledges the particular, specific ache of watching your circle of lifelong friends, the ones who knew you before your children were born, who remembered your wedding day in vivid detail, who understood the jokes no one else finds funny anymore because they were there when the joke was born, shrink year after year, name after name. Each loss is its own private grief, distinct from the others, but the accumulation of these losses creates something else entirely. A specific, quiet isolation that comes from being one of the last people alive who remembers certain parts of your own history. When a friend who knew you at 25 dies, a version of you dies along with them, the version only they could see clearly, only they could confirm ever existed at all. This is why many people in their 80s and 90s describe a peculiar kind of loneliness that has nothing whatsoever to do with lacking company. You can be surrounded by loving family, visited often, cared for well, and still feel this particular ache, because family, however wonderful and devoted, cannot replace the specific witness that old friendship once provided. Nobody else remembers you the way that friend did, and there is simply no substitute for being known across the full, unbroken arc of a life. This truth is rarely spoken aloud because it can sound almost like ingratitude toward the people who are still present and still loving you well. It is not that at all. It is simply an honest acknowledgement that different relationships fill different roles, and some roles, once vacated, remain quietly, permanently empty. What helps many find over time is not trying to fill that particular emptiness with new friendships that pretend to replace the old ones, an impossible task, but instead allowing new relationships to exist entirely on their own terms, different in kind, valuable in their own right, but never required to replicate what was lost. Maybe you've noticed yourself scanning the obituary section of the local paper each morning, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of something closer to a quiet, dutiful vigil, checking to see whether today is the day you learn another name from your past has left the world. Or perhaps you are the last one left who remembers why a certain joke was funny in the first place. A story involving a car that broke down on a specific highway 40 years ago, or a nickname given during a summer nobody else alive was present for, and you find yourself laughing alone at a memory nobody else can share in anymore, because there is simply no one left to share it with. This is a peculiar kind of solitude, one that has nothing to do with how often the phone rings or how many visitors come through the door. New friendships, when they arrive later in life, can be wonderful and genuinely nourishing in their own right, but they arrive without that particular decade's-long history attached, and pretending otherwise only sets both people up for a quiet disappointment neither of them deserves. That's not ingratitude toward the people who stayed. That's simply honesty about the people who didn't get to. The silence left behind by old friends is real, and it deserves to be named rather than hidden away out of politeness. Naming it does not make you bitter or ungrateful. It makes you honest about a loneliness that so many carry silently, quietly believing they are the only one who feels it this deeply. Before we go further, let's pause here for just a moment, because if you have felt even one of these truths so far, I want you to know something plainly. You are not imagining any of this, and you are certainly not alone in it. Thousands of people watching this right now have nodded at something you just heard, maybe without even realizing they were nodding along, maybe wiping their eyes quickly and glancing around the room to see if anyone noticed. There is real comfort in that shared recognition, the simple knowledge that your private experience is, in fact, a deeply common one, shared by people you will never meet but who understand you completely all the same. There are still 4 more truths ahead, some gentler than what we've covered so far, one considerably harder than anything we've touched on yet. So stay with me a little longer, settle back into your chair, and let's keep going together, because the next truth quietly shapes how so many people experience their final decades, often without ever saying it out loud to another living soul, not even the people closest to them. That next truth has to do with something deceptively small, the word help, and how impossibly hard it can become to say it. Have you ever needed something simple? A jar opened, a ride to an appointment, help carrying something up a short flight of stairs, and felt a flush of shame before you even asked? Have you caught yourself saying, "I'm fine," Really? When you very clearly were not. Here's the truth. Asking for help after 70 often feels like losing a piece of your identity, and almost no one warns you how disorienting that feeling can actually be when it arrives. For most of your adult life, you were the one who helped others. You carried the groceries, fixed the leaking faucet at midnight, drove the kids to school through the snow, solved problems for everyone around you without being asked twice. Being capable was not just something you did, it slowly became part of who you understood yourself to be, at the very core. So when the body slows down, when eyesight dims a little more each year, when a hip no longer cooperates the way it used to without complaint, needing assistance does not feel like a simple logistical adjustment. It feels, instead, like an identity crisis arriving quietly through the back door. It can feel, painfully and privately, like becoming a burden rather than remaining a contributor to the people you love. This fear is one of the most common, least discussed sources of quiet distress in later life, not the physical limitation itself, which is manageable in its own way, but what asking for help seems to say, falsely, about your worth as a person. But here is what is almost always missed in that private moment of shame. Needing help is not evidence of diminishment. It is evidence of having lived long enough to reach a genuinely different chapter, one with entirely different rules than the ones you spent decades mastering. Every stage of life carries its own particular blend of dependence and independence woven together, infancy, adolescence, parenthood, and yes, later life too, in its own honest way. Accepting help is not a surrender of dignity. It is, in fact, one of the most quietly courageous acts available to a person, because it requires releasing an old, hard-earned identity in favor of a truer, more complete one. A person who is finally allowed to receive, not only to give endlessly. Many families, when this shift happens with honesty instead of shame, discover that asking for help actually deepens relationships rather than straining them the way it's feared it might. Children and grandchildren often want nothing more in the world than the chance to give back even a small fraction of what was given to them for decades without complaint. Refusing help out of stubborn pride can unintentionally rob loved ones of that meaningful, mutual chance to reciprocate a lifetime of care. Think of the moment of handing over the car keys, maybe for the first time, to a son or daughter who has gently suggested it might be time. For many people, that single small exchange of metal across a kitchen table carries more emotional weight than almost any other moment in these later years, because driving represented freedom, competence, and the ability to simply go wherever you wished without asking permission from anyone. Or consider the quiet decision to finally use a cane in public, after months of leaving it by the door out of stubbornness, worried about what it might signal to strangers passing by on the sidewalk. These moments feel enormous internally, even when no one else notices them as anything more than ordinary. But here is the truth worth holding on to. The people who love you are rarely counting your losses of independence the way you fear they are. More often, they are simply grateful for the chance to be useful to someone who spent decades being useful to them, and they would tell you so plainly if you gave them the opening to say it. That's not weakness showing itself. That's simply the natural rhythm of a life finally allowed to receive as generously as it once gave. Letting someone else carry something for you, physically or emotionally, is not the end of your independence. It is simply independence taking a new, quieter shape, one where dignity comes not from doing absolutely everything alone, but from allowing love to move freely in both directions, the way it was always meant to. From that same tender place comes a truth that many people carry more silently than any other truth on this entire list. A truth about the words that were never said out loud when they should have been. Have you ever lain awake replaying a conversation from decades ago? Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. A thank you never spoken plainly. An apology postponed again and again until it was too late to give it. An I love you that felt too vulnerable to say out loud at the time, so it simply stayed unsaid? Here is the truth. The regrets that stay with people longest are almost never about the mistakes they made along the way. They are about the words they didn't say when there was still time. We tend to assume that regret in later life revolves around big decisions. A career not taken, a move never made, a risk avoided out of fear. But ask someone in their 80s what actually keeps them awake most nights, and the answer is rarely so grand or dramatic. It is smaller than that, and far more human in its quiet weight. It's the argument with a parent that was never truly resolved before that parent passed away. It's the old friend who reached out one last time, and the phone call that was postponed until it was simply too late to return it at all. It's a child who needed to hear the words, "I'm proud of you," spoken clearly, and instead received only quiet, assumed affection that was never once put into words. These regrets cut deeper than regrets over actions, because actions, however flawed, can sometimes be undone, apologized for, corrected with time and effort. But silence, once sealed permanently by death or by distance, becomes final in a way that nothing else quite is. There is a particular, specific kind of grief reserved entirely for words that will now never be said to the one person who needed to hear them most. And here is the quiet wisdom hidden carefully inside that pain. This truth is not meant to punish you for what you didn't say in the past, when you didn't know any better. It is meant, instead, to loosen your tongue for what remains unsaid right now, today, while there is still time left to say it. There may still be people in your life at this very moment. A child, a sibling, an old and dear friend, waiting, whether they consciously know it or not, for the very words you have been holding back out of old habit, awkwardness, or a lingering fear of vulnerability. As the novelist George Eliot once wrote, "It is never too late to be what you might have been." That sentiment applies not only to who you still become, but to what you finally choose to say out loud before the chance quietly passes. Perhaps there is a letter somewhere in your house right now, half-written years ago, never finished, never sent, addressed to someone who may no longer even be reachable at that address. Perhaps there is a sibling you haven't spoken to in years over a disagreement whose original cause neither of you can even fully remember anymore, only the silence it left behind. Many people, sitting beside a loved one in their final days, find themselves suddenly saying things they had saved for decades. "I forgive you," or "I was proud of you the whole time, I just never said it," or simply "thank you for everything." And the relief in the room is often visible on both faces, even when words no longer come easily from the person receiving them. The lesson from that bedside moment is not that you must wait for an ending to find your courage. It is that the courage was always available to you right now at this ordinary kitchen table on this ordinary Tuesday phone call, if you are willing to reach for it a little sooner than the situation seems to demand. That's not weakness, saying it out loud after all these years. That's the only real cure available for a regret that has no other remedy. The words you have been saving for someday are not owed to some distant, better moment that may never arrive on schedule. They are owed to today, to the people still within reach of your voice, right now while it can still be heard. That is not a small truth to carry. It may, quietly, be the most urgent truth on this entire list. Carrying that same urgency forward, there is a truth about identity itself, about who you become when the roles that once defined you completely, quietly begin to disappear one by one. Have you ever caught your own reflection in a window and felt a strange, momentary confusion, as though you were looking at someone unfamiliar, even though you recognize every line and feature staring back at you? Have you asked yourself, now that I am no longer the provider, or the parent of young children, or the person with the demanding career, who exactly am I underneath all of that? Here's the truth. For most of adult life, identity is built almost entirely around roles. Employee, spouse, parent, provider, caretaker, the reliable one everyone counted on. These roles give structure, clear purpose, and a ready, simple answer to the question, "Who are you?" whenever anyone asks. But one by one, after 70, many of these roles quietly dissolve without warning or ceremony. Retirement removes the professional identity that once filled 40 or 50 hours a week for decades. Children grow up, build their own households far away, and no longer need daily parenting the way they once did. A spouse may pass, removing a role occupied faithfully for 50 years or more, leaving a silence where a whole shared identity used to live. And suddenly, a person can be left facing an unsettling, almost existential question that younger years rarely force anyone to confront directly. Who am I exactly when I am no longer defined by what I do for other people every single day? This can feel destabilizing, even quietly frightening, particularly for people whose entire sense of worth was built around productivity and caretaking for so long. But many who move through this disorientation with honesty, rather than avoidance, discover something unexpected waiting patiently on the other side. A version of themselves that existed all along, underneath every role, simply waiting to be noticed again. Freed from the responsibilities that once organized every single hour of every single day, some people rediscover curiosities set aside decades earlier. A love of painting abandoned in their 20s, an interest in history never pursued, a desire simply to sit quietly and think without obligation pulling them elsewhere every few minutes. This is not identity loss, despite how it feels in the moment. It is identity excavation, the slow, patient uncovering of a self that was always present but rarely had room to breathe under the weight of all those responsibilities. The roles were never truly you at your core. They were containers you lived inside of for a season of your life, useful and necessary at the time. And a container disappearing does not mean the person who lived inside it disappears too. Think of the first Monday morning after retirement, when the alarm clock that governed 40 years of your life suddenly has nothing left to summon you toward, and you lie there in the quiet, unsure what a Monday is even supposed to feel like anymore. Or consider the widow who, at every social gathering for 50 years, was introduced as "and his wife," and who now stands at the edge of a room wondering, honestly, who she is introduced as when there is no longer a his to follow. These are not small adjustments. They are genuine reorientations of the self, and they deserve to be treated with the same seriousness as any other major life transition, rather than dismissed as simply adjusting to retirement or getting used to being alone. Many people, months or even years into this process, describe picking up a paintbrush they hadn't touched since art class in high school, or finally learning the piano their mother always wished they'd stuck with, and feeling, to their own surprise, more like themselves than they had felt in decades of meetings and school lunches and mortgage payments. That's not losing yourself, however frightening it feels at first. That's finally meeting the self who was waiting patiently underneath all those roles the entire time. The roles fall away, one after another, and what remains is not emptiness, whatever it might feel like in the first disorienting weeks. It is, for many people, the first real chance in decades to simply be, without a title, without a daily obligation, without anyone needing you to be anything other than exactly, fully who you already are. And that brings us, finally, to the eighth truth, one that quietly ties every truth before it together into something whole. Have you noticed that the things which bring you real joy today are almost embarrassingly small compared to what used to excite you decades ago? A bird pausing at the window, a grandchild's crayon drawing taped crookedly to your refrigerator, the particular golden warmth of sunlight through a kitchen window in the late afternoon, exactly when it hits the counter just right. Here is the truth. Joy after 70 does not disappear. It simply gets smaller, quieter, and far more precise. And this is not a diminishment of any kind. It is a refinement decades in the careful making. In youth and middle age, joy is often loud and external. Promotions, milestones, celebrations, achievements measured carefully by other people's applause and approval. But something happens as the decades quietly accumulate, one after another. The nervous system, having weathered enough loss and enough love in equal measure, becomes exquisitely sensitive to small, genuine moments that once passed by completely unnoticed in a busier life. A cup of tea made just the way you like it, no rushing. A phone call from a grandchild who didn't have to call, but did anyway just because. These moments, once mere background noise in a busier, louder life, become the entire foreground now. This is not a lowering of standards, though it might look that way from the outside. It is the opposite, in fact, a raising of appreciation to a level of precision that busier years simply couldn't afford to notice. Many describe this stage of life as finally being able